I wonder
but
if,
they hope.
in your work in biochemistry, obviously, the primarily studying living things, living
Mhm.
organisms. Have you had any kind of, I don't, when you became a believer, what were your thoughts on the creation story?
Well, yeah, that you know, the creation story is. You mean the creation story in the Bible or in general? The general idea, the origin.
I suppose the general idea and what comes from the Bible, I guess, our understanding from it.
Yeah. Well, I mean that's very interesting because when I was young, which is some time ago, uh, I learned, even though scientists knew that was out of date, but when you're in school, there's a 30 to 50-year lag before the actual science hits the elementary educational curriculum. So what I learned was that the universe was eternal. It always existed, and that's it. It's just always been there. Now that's mysterious. That's weird. Sounds strange, but I accept it. Okay, that's a fact. That's how it is. I don't. My father, who I mentioned was a chemist, was also a very strong atheist. But he told me that science doesn't answer all questions. This whole idea of scientism is not a scientific idea. There very few scientists believe in scientism, even the atheists. We, as soon as you start working in science, you realize there are many, 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 many questions that you can't address scientifically. And one of those is the origin of the universe. We have no idea. And by the way, it's still true. We still don't know. What we do know now is that the Bible was right. There was a beginning, right? I mean that's something where the Bible was right before the science was. There was a beginning, but we don't know how that happened. We don't. There's no clue as to I mean, there are ideas, there are theories, but there's no evidence for any of it, and we don't know what happened. I, as you said, am a biologist, and the most interesting. Well, there are two interesting origins for me, which is life and humanity, and my own personal view is that God played a role somehow. But scientifically, what I say is we cannot currently explain the origin of life and won't be able to using the science that we have today, which is not strange or surprising because that's been true throughout history. We a lot of people say such and such is against science, but when they say that, they're implying such and such is against the science that we now know in 2024. But we know one thing, which is that the science of 2024 is not the final word. It has never been the final word. If we went back year of my birth, right after World War II, uh, the biology that was known then was nothing compared to the biology we know now. Physics as well. If we went back 100 years, or well, a little more than 100, let's say end of the 19th century, physics was wrong. It didn't. It thought it was over. Arthur Thompson wrote a book where he talked about uh, what's left to know in physics, and very little. A few more decimal points and some constants. Oh, and then there was this little thing about light. Didn't quite make sense how the speed of light didn't. They couldn't understand that. Well, that turned out to be more than a little thing. That turned out to change all of physics. Right in 1905, everything changed. Then you have quantum theory and everything else. And where are we now? We're not done with physics. I mean, quite the opposite. The results of CERN are mystifying in many cases. The standard model, a lot of particle theory. I don't understand this stuff, so I'm not saying anything with expertise. But what I understand is that there's a lot of unanswered questions. So that's always going to be true. So when people say, well, the Bible is scientifically wrong, we now know that. Why didn't God why didn't God inspire people to tell the scientific truth? The universe is 14 billion years old, etc. And the answer to me is very simple. God came to earth and told us a lot of things. But Jesus never says a word of science in the Gospels. He never says, hey, by the way, guys, come here. I want to tell you something. Let me explain to you, the actual age of the earth. Let me explain to you how all these organisms came to be. This is the science. You should know this because I'm God and I'm the Son of God. And I'm going to. He never said anything that was scientific. The closest he came was about, a fig tree and the mustard seed. And they were both not exactly scientific. So why is that? And the reason I think is very clear. It's not up to God to tell us how the natural world works. That's our job. And if Jesus had told us the scientific truth of the world, not only would the people at the time not have a clue what he was talking about, neither would we. Because it's an easy prediction to say that 100 years from now, people will look back at us today and say, boy, were they dumb. They didn't know about, and, make up words. I mean, they didn't know about all this stuff, which we now know because, we're smarter. That's the nature of science. It keeps changing. It keeps growing. So, it's not up to God to explain to us science because he can't. Nobody would get it until whenever we're done with science, until everything is known. And frankly, I will tell you that day will not come because what we now know about scientific knowledge is it's fractal. It keeps branching off. Every time you get an answer, there are 7 more questions that come up. That's true in every field. You never get a final. I don't know a field in science where it's over. It's done. We know everything. There's nothing more to do. There's not one field like that. Isn't that interesting? Why should that be?
It's
That's telling us something.
Yeah. Reflecting on what you're saying too, you seem quite comfortable with not knowing, the unknown. I mean, was that something you had to confront when you became a believer from a qualitative, evidence-based background?
Well, I
Because
have to
obviously
say,
there are many questions that you'll still have about things pertaining to the gospel.
Yeah. I think I should have put it in the book. This is another example of science and faith in harmony because science, you have to be comfortable not knowing stuff in science because you're never going to know everything. Okay. Now we found out that the genetic material is DNA, which everybody thought was impossible because it's such a boring compound that only had, a few things in it. How could it possibly be a code? And then we discovered, Watson and Crick discovered, that, it is it's a code. Base pairing makes it a code. Okay, but so we know everything about DNA? No. What we have found out recently from, the Human Genome Project is that about 2% of the DNA codes for genes. 2%, less than 2%. What? Well, so questions, okay, what does the rest of it do? Why does a cell keep replicating at huge cost this molecule, which is gigantic, only what 2% of which they need? Well, it turns out they need a lot more than that because the other sequences do things. But we don't know we don't know all of that yet. And we keep discovering new stuff that just makes everything so complicated and so complex. Nothing makes anything simpler that we find. Every time there's a discovery, it's, oh my God, there's another enzyme, there's another pathway that nobody knew about that's really important. It just never ends. And so I don't think it will ever end. And what that tells us is something about the nature of God, the nature of reality, the nature of his creation. It's sort of beyond us, I would say. As whatever we are, maybe we're one step on the way to something higher, that will understand everything. But I tend to think that that's one of the rewards we'll get in heaven. At least I hope I do. If I get to heaven and I'm told what do you want to do here now, and I'll say, tell me everything.